I'm Lana with LOPA, and I'm so excited tonight to have the crew from Autism BrainNet to join us and kind of teach us about what our connection is with what their connection is with LOPA, and really just educate us all on a lot of things that we really don't realize are happening. I'm excited about our research projects that we're involved in, and this is just one. So I'm going to hand it over to Lilium with Autism BrainNet.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're all here with us tonight. I'm Lilium Acosta. I'm the outreach manager for Autism BrainNet. My colleague, Cece McBride, she is our outreach specialist. And Carolyn Hare is our wonderful clinical director. Okay, Carolyn, you ready?
Yep, sure am. Lilium, thank you for the introduction. And really, Lana, thank you, Kirsten and Tina, for having us this evening and your collective teams. You know, we've just enjoyed working with you so much, and we're looking forward to having this opportunity to connect with more of your community and well, share what information we have to share, but hopefully answer some of the questions that might come up along the way. Next slide. So what we thought might be meaningful would be to just share with you a little bit about our organization. And for those of you who aren't familiar, although I've already heard and seen that we have some families of children with autism joining us this evening, we'll provide a little bit of an overview of the diagnostics associated with autism spectrum disorders. We'll talk a little bit about postmortem brain tissue research and why it's important. And then we'll just touch on some of the things that we've learned by studying postmortem brain tissue. All right, so Autism BrainNet as an organization was launched actually in 2014. So just about, well, almost 7.5 years ago at this point. And the idea was that while some postmortem brain tissue research was happening, we weren't able to satisfy researchers' needs in having a substantial quantity of postmortem brain tissue donations to study. And also we needed to improve the quality of those donations. And so we developed, and we'll talk a little bit more about our staffing at these sites in a little bit, but sites around the country so that we could connect with people on a regional or local level, but also make sure that we were able to quickly and efficiently make sure that donations were routed to the closest site. Next slide. So in terms of autism, you know, as a disorder, those of you who have children with autism are probably familiar that the diagnosis has changed somewhat over the past few years, but the essence of it has remained the same. It is a behavioral diagnosis. So still to this point, there's not a blood test or an MRI or anything that can be done to diagnose autism. It's a behavioral diagnosis, which means that we observe a child in great detail to see if they have the characteristics that we consider to be consistent with the diagnosis of autism. Those characteristics include an impairment in social interactions, an impairment in communication, as well as stereotyped and repetitive behaviors and interests. You know, something that I think is just really interesting is that, and probably many of you are familiar with, the rise in incidence has been dramatic since autism was first discovered. Today, we know that 1 out of every 54 children will be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. We also know that it is diagnosed 4 times more often in boys than in girls. What we don't know about that, however, is whether it's that girls are better at or more apt at masking some of the behaviors that we would look at as being consistent with the diagnosis, or if it simply is happening less frequently, if the diagnosis is truly happening less frequently in girls than in boys. One thing that I just wanted to mention too, as Cece, Lilium, and I were researching for this presentation, I noticed on the CDC's site something else that has evolved in terms of the incidence of diagnosing children with autism is that we are now diagnosing African American children and white children at the same rate. And while on the surface that may not seem very promising, it actually is. And the reason that that's promising is that it means we're getting better at providing equal access to the very important pediatric screening and diagnostic care that everyone deserves. Where we're still lacking, I think, is with Hispanic populations, and that could be for a variety of reasons and a conversation that we could get into in greater detail another time. But next slide. So we talked about those three main criteria of diagnosing autism spectrum disorder. So the impairments in communication, social interaction, repetitive and stereotyped behaviors and interests. But what's important to understand is that what that looks like in each individual with a diagnosis of autism is going to be very different. Autism is a heterogeneous, however you prefer to say it, is a heterogeneous disorder. And so an impairment in communication may look in one child to be that they're just completely nonverbal or unable to speak. In another child, they may be a full-on chatterbox ready to share their encyclopedic recall about their favorite topic of interest. In terms of the impairment in communication, it also can look like a child who really prefers to be alone and maybe doesn't even appear to be hearing what's happening around them, to the child who doesn't understand the boundaries and wants to be glued to your side all the time. So it's a heterogeneous disorder, and it's important to know that it impacts every person and their family very differently. So this is the million-dollar question. What causes autism? And the short answer is we still don't know. We're learning, and that's really kind of part, obviously, of the mission of Autism BrainNet. But we do have a sense. We're learning that there are certainly some genetic underpinnings to autism. Now, genetics aren't implicated in every child who is autistic, but in many of them. So we've learned that there are about 100 genes that are implicated in autism. Really, they're probably closer to like 1,000 genes that are implicated in autism. But, we're still learning. Many people think that it's an interaction between genetics and the environment that can cause autism. But again, we just don't know. And then there is some recent research coming out by one of our node directors, in fact, Dr. Matt Anderson, looking at immune factors possibly implicated in causing autism. Next slide. And so that leads us to the importance of being able to study postmortem brain tissue. So when you think about other disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, for example, those disorders, we've been able to learn the most about them by studying brain tissue and really starting to understand what are those structural differences at the cellular and molecular level between, in this case, people with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but for our purposes, what are those structural differences between somebody who has a diagnosis with autism and somebody who does not? Next slide. And so what have we learned so far? Have we learned anything so far? The short answer is we're still learning, but one of my favorite, or I think one of the studies that has had the greatest impact on me, being a former special education teacher, actually was done by another one of our node directors, Dr. Cindy Schumann, who looked at this little area of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for helping us to regulate our emotions. It's responsible for helping us to, our fear responses, our anxiety, our aggression, all of those things are sort of managed or occur within the amygdala. And what Dr. Schumann learned by looking at the amygdala is that early on in children, the neuronal density, so the density of neurons in the amygdala of children, is significantly greater for those with autism than those without. But what's interesting is that later in life, the density of neurons decreases. And so that's interesting to me for two reasons. The first is that, a lot of our kiddos with autism have extreme anxiety. And you can imagine that it's the density of neurons that's contributing to their extreme anxiety. What's interesting, coming back to me being a special education teacher, is that lack of density, or the decrease in density of neurons for older people who were older that were studied, there's room for us to improve in our intervention to prevent that reduction in neuronal density. So it just speaks to the importance of early and ongoing intervention. Okay. Next slide. So who are we? You've gotten to meet Lillian and Cece and myself. This is the rest of our team. Earlier on, I was explaining that we have 3 sites around the country, and that is the case. One of our programs, and Dr. Schumann, actually, whose research I was just discussing, they're based in Sacramento, California at the UC Davis Mind Institute. We also have Dr. Matt Anderson and his tissue coordinator, Monica, at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, which is part of Harvard in Boston. And then down south, closest to you all, we have our program at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, led by Dr. Taminga and Kelly Gleason, the tissue coordinator there. We also have 2 international sites, one at Douglas Bell Canada Brain Bank in Montreal, Canada, and Dr. Olaf and Sorge runs our program at Oxford in the UK. And then finally, we have a really specialized program at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, which is the Autism Saloina Library, and that's managed by Dr. Patrick Hoff. So that's part of our team. That's the leadership of our team. But of course, there are 100 people in the background, not literally 100, but lots of people in the background supporting all of the work that our node directors are doing. And that's me. It's always funny to see yourself twice on screen. So of course, then there's myself and my clinical counterpart, Nicole Coman. So we are responsible for interfacing with our partners, including LOPA, but also ultimately with our donor families, which is really the core of what I do and what I take a lot of pride in doing. So we get asked fairly often, well, can I be a donor to Autism BrainNet? And so we thought it would be helpful to share a little bit about our inclusion criteria to be a donor, a postmortem brain tissue donor to our program. And so for anyone who has a diagnosis of autism or a related neurodevelopmental disorder, so that could include Prader-Willi syndrome, Phelan-McDermott, or related genetic disorder like KIF1A. If you have a diagnosis, we would be incredibly grateful for the family to consider donation to our program at any age, any co-occurring medical condition. That's part of our inclusion criteria. For our control donors, or for people who do not have a diagnosis of autism or any other related neurodevelopmental, neurologic, or psychiatric condition, up to the age of 50, you could be a brain donor to our program. So this slide, I feel, is especially important because many people imagine, and it's a really logical assumption, that one brain donation contributes to one research project. But in our case, what actually happens is that once a brain donation has reached one of our sites that we were talking about earlier, it is then carefully preserved so that it can be saved for decades into the future and actually will contribute to dozens of research programs over time. And so it's just important that we convey that to you, that one donation can have a massive, massive impact. And last but certainly not least of our slides, we wanted to thank our partners at LOPA for having us tonight, but also because they have become, just excellent extension of our team. And I hope that we have also become an excellent extension of their team in supporting our donor families. They work so hard to make the donation process go as smoothly and as easily for families as possible in a really difficult time. And from my perspective in working with donor families, they're just so good at working with us to make sure that families are provided with the support that they need and deserve after donation. And we're just incredibly grateful for this partnership. And we'll leave you with this slide, which is, we get asked often, and I'm sure that our friends at LOPA get asked this question often, how do you do what you do? What is it that draws you to work in the field of donation, in the world of organ procurement or tissue banking? And really for us, it is that we're in a position where we get to honor someone in a way that is so unique and ensure that their legacy continues, that their legacy continues. And it's a real privilege to be in this position. And again, we're just incredibly grateful to LOPA for inviting us into their community so we can continue to do this, hopefully, better. So that's it.
I do have one more slide, Carolyn.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. And this is just to invite you to, for more information, to visit our website. We have information about donation, as Carolyn mentioned, why it's important in furthering autism research. We have a toll-free number as well that's staffed 24/7. If you're interested in receiving research highlights from us, we do those quarterly, so we won't spam you. You are welcome to also sign up for our newsletter, and we're also on social media. So anyway, just wanted to end this with a little invitation to visit us for more information.
One thing that I wanted to ask that I'm wondering if, thinking people might be wondering is, when we say register to become an organ donor in Louisiana, does this cover that? And that answer is no. Tina, do you want to get into kind of a little bit more about registries or banking or anything?
We work with a handful of brain banks, and they have signups. Like, we could send the families to the website, depending on what the condition is. Of course, autism, we would send them over to BrainNet. Other things like PTSD or drug addiction, we work with Miami, the Brain Endowment Bank at Miami. So we work with a handful, and I just give anybody who calls me, I give them different options, let them go look it up. If they pre-sign up, it's a given. Those brain banks will get in touch with me when someone passes, and we can set it up to go, do a recovery for them.
So just to be clear, when someone signs up in the Louisiana registry, they are not signing up to donate their brain, just in case you're wondering that or questioning that. That is not one of the, tissues that we have kind of listed on our registry.
Correct.
Just keep in mind that that's something separate.